China is a major power. There's no question about that. Over the past 40 years, it has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, transformed its infrastructure, and reshaped global trade. Its growth story commands attention and respect. But there's another side to the story. Behind the headlines about megacities, economic growth, and ambitious infrastructure projects, there are challenges that don't always make the news. China, like every major power, faces economic pressures, political dilemmas, social tensions, and strategic vulnerabilities. And the interesting thing is that these challenges are quite unique. Unlike its powerful economic peers in the West, China's system is not only driven by market economic forces, but also guided by communist principles. It will be one of the most exciting questions of our time if this Chinese system can truly rival or even succeed over the political systems of the West. Today, in War Diplomacy, we will talk about the most pressing problems facing China today and thereby assess its potential role in the world going forward. Welcome to War Diplomacy, your trusted podcast on international affairs. Today, we will take a step back and look at China's challenges more closely. We will explore how overconsumption, debt are straining the economy, how centralization and succession uncertainty are shaping politics, and how demographic trends are testing the social contract. We'll also examine the international side, China's rising tensions with the West, its technological ambitions, and the risks in the military and energy spheres. I'm here with my co-host, Fabio Almada, today. How are you doing, Fabio?
Aramis, hello. Doing really fine. Thanks all for asking. Really looking forward for today's discussion. It's not the first time that we talk about China in the podcast. We'll leave the links to those episodes we have on the country in the show notes. But the angle today is really peculiar, just as you've said. I think that today's point is not really to paint a black picture. China's rise isn't over, far from it. But understanding the pressures that China faces really helps see this bigger picture, right? And to guide us throughout this conversation, we've invited Aaron Chan, a young professional and foreign policy colleague of mine, and actually the Washington, D.C. managing director. He works as a senior associate at the Asia Group, and he's over a decade of experience from China and the Indo-Pacific. Aaron, welcome to World Diplomacy. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Aramis. It's a pleasure to be here and really looking forward to the conversation today.
No, same here, and I truly encourage any listener that's listening to us from any of the cities where young professionals in foreign policy has a branch to check for events and opportunities. It's a really nice association for forging international and professional connections with other people that work in the field, such as us three. Quick reminder that there's branches in San Francisco, New York City, Washington, D.C., in Toronto, in Canada, and here in Europe, one in London, one in Brussels, and of course, one in Tokyo as well. So anyone listening from these cities, don't hesitate to check them out.
So China built its growth on production and exports. This very much aligns with their communist tradition of pushing for industry and hard work. On the other hand, they never developed their domestic consumption as much, which is much more in a capitalistic tradition. Aaron, do you think it's realistic that China can turn this around one day, given that this mismatch between production and consumption is already having its impacts on the Chinese economy?
I think China can shift towards a more consumption-driven economy, but it's just kind of the way that it will do it is difficult or more difficult than it would be in a Western society, as we see traditional bounds of development across the world. The Chinese economy obviously set up after World War II. You had the Great Leap Forward, and it was very heavily focused on this kind of land-based real estate and production economy, as you mentioned. And so you can see that, sectors like EVs, batteries, solar panels, this kind of production forward approach has made them essentially the manufacturer of the world. And has really helped in some aspects for, let's say, solar panels for the green economy. to make things more affordable, very cheap across the global capacity space. But when you're only focused on production, real estate, and I'll say also GDP, it feeds into this kind of need for sustained growth as a GDP powerhouse that they really emphasize this. So I think yes, to make a long answer short, yes, they can do it, but it'll take some time. It'll take some policy revisions. I think we're seeing some pressure also from the most recent 5-year plan that came out. A lot of the wording is trying to focus more on consumption and less savings in the household. So it's definitely a process that is slowly happening, but we'll have to see because they're going to have to retool their entire economy.
And why do you think this is such an issue for China in the first place to have this reliance on production at the moment?
Well, partly we're looking at kind of increased geopolitical tensions right now between the US and China. But even if you're looking at it domestically, we think in the West, oh, if the price is low, I can go and buy an EV for a couple $1,000 rather than, here in the States, average car price is like around 40 to $50,000. So, why wouldn't people spend? But when all of the domestic environment is pulling down prices, doesn't mean a automatic boost to consumption. Households are still cautious because wages are slowed. Property market has been weakening. We've seen that over the economic data that's been released this year. For young people, job security and job progression feels uncertain. Stock prices are kind of not enough when the broader economic mood is defensive. So this is where kind of deflation starts to matter. If every central bank, every bank in the world wants a little bit of inflation, right? Because if I can, let's say I have a bike I want to buy for $1,000. If I can hold on to my $1,000 and the bike price deflates over time, why wouldn't I just save my money and buy the bike later when it's, $950 instead of 1,000? So you want a little bit of inflation in a healthy economy just so that it continues prices grow a little bit, but you want obviously wage growth to go with that and, asset classes to go with that. So when China's consumer price index has been hovering around zero, with several months of slight decline this year, producer prices, which are negative for more than a year, make a kind of environment that's dangerous in terms of a deflationary manner for production and consumption.
So essentially, the Chinese, they're just producing too much stuff at the moment, and either they export what they are producing in masses, or the domestic consumption is going up. Otherwise, you may have a lot of companies facing difficulties and the economy turning downward. What do you think about the plans of the Chinese Communist Party? Do you really think that this is feasible? I mean, of course, they try to rebalance things a bit, but also from an ideological perspective, one would really question if they really want to fix this issue.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Aramis. I think it is realistic because as we're seeing from the economic data that the Chinese party is releasing, it's very clear to see the real estate market is quite a big situation for them right now, especially with how difficult it is for new families or married couples to buy houses. So in Chinese culture, when two people get married, it's expected that the husband buy the house, and with prices just being all over the place, it's very hard for them to purchase the first home. Marriage rate is actually being impacted as well. So it has social repercussions in terms of like the cultural understanding. I will say, in terms of communist ideology or not, I think it is still realistic to say, even though it doesn't have as sharp of a feedback system as, let's say, a democracy, they do get feedback from internally in the party. You can see it from they do a lot of kind of feedback, more nuanced through reports and investigative products from like universities, think tanks within China. That's really how they say, hey, this policy may not be working in a way that doesn't outright criticize the party. But the architecture of the system, and I think this is part of the reason why I think me personally, GDP is kind of a harmful economic rhetoric, is because when you're evaluating an economy just by what it produces, you kind of gear the entire system to be focused on how do I boost production as much as possible? How do I boost, all these metrics I feed into GDP as much as possible, so that I can show that I have the healthiest economy. So I think we should expect a gradual adjustment. I would expect more targeted support for consumption. We've seen there's been speculation about kind of stimulus to the general Chinese public. That's been debated in China watching circles for a couple of months now. But I think there's going to be some attempts to consolidate the overcapacity. There's going to be continued pushes in strategic sectors because those are tied to like key national priorities. That's a policy metric that you were talking about, but an ongoing effort to keep deflation from becoming a mindset. Because I think the clear example is Japan. And, Japan's lost generations now, where I think we're into the fourth or fifth lost generation for Japan. No one in Asia wants to be a second Japan, just because of the economic harm that deflationary traps have on an economy. So, yeah, I think it can evolve slowly, but it's hard because their economy, their system is built to reward kind of the production behaviors that we all are slaves to today, in the economic system.
That's a really comprehensive explanation. I think you set up the ground perfectly. Listening to it, what really stands out to me is how many of these current challenges China is facing come from the very model that powered its rise in the last 20, 30, 40 years. A strategy that worked amazingly. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and it turned China into an industrial superpower. I think that's an amazing success story if you look at it. But now we see how it's starting to hit the limits of that model. The economy is starting to slow. As you've said, wages are flattening, and China is getting closer to what some economists call the middle income trap. So that's a moment when a country can no longer rely on cheap labor and massive investment to just keep growing. So at that time, we mentioned how overcapacity and weak consumption are putting more pressure on prices, and we see, as you've said, how these affects, and Japan is a perfect example, just as mentioned. But I think that overcapacity is one side of the story. I mean, we're not going to go so much in depth. This is not a finance podcast, but there's also the issue of debt, specifically at the local level. China's local governments are carrying somewhere between $7 and $11 trillion on liabilities, a lot eating under the books. And this debt is deeply intertwined with the property sector. We know a lot about issues with the property sector in China, and that represents 70% of household wealth. So that's a lot of money.
Before we end this section on the economic aspects of China's system, Aaron, I wanted to talk about the issue of debt because this is a global issue. All countries across the world are heavily indebted. It's famously known that the US is facing rising pressures here with the recent policy changes of the Trump administration. So, in comparison to other parts of the world, how bad do you think this whole debt issue in China is?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on your outlook for the economy of China. So if you're very bearish on the China's growth, their economy, it's very bad, right? Because the whole economic system that we were alluding to is predicated on the local debt, right? They own the land, they sell it, and if as long as real estate prices continue to rise, then there's no problems, right? But it's when those real estate prices start to flip that debt starts to become real and very dangerous very fast. So it depends on the outlook that you have for the economy. To Fabio's point as well, so I used to work in the the international gaming space, meaning not video games but gambling. And so one of the things that we were looking at too was evaluating China's middle class is reaching a point where they're kind of hitting that point where they've got a lot of discretionary funds that a lot of them use it for, or a lot of people, when they hit that level of income, start going abroad, start traveling more. I think in the last couple of years, we've seen an explosion in Chinese tourism. So there is this kind of undercurrent of still continued improvement in middle class income. It's just not at the point that we would like to see. So I think the Chinese economy will still keep on growing. I'm more worried about kind of the forced overcapacity for these like ghost cities. That this debt that the local and provincial governments are holding is quite substantial. So I think it really depends on where you are on the economy, but as long as real estate prices are marginally continuing to increase, then the problems won't kind of come crashing down all at the same time. And I think the party is aware of that, and they're trying to shift out of this kind of more production-based economy.
And I think this is the interesting part about China's economy, the whole debt discussion, because this bet that you have been talking about on the future, I feel like so far it has been working out for them because all of China's growth over the past few decades has been fueled by debt. So it means up until now, it's been working quite well. And now, if we're looking at the latest reports on where China is in high tech technology, then we are seeing that China is leading across the board on many things, way ahead of the US and Europe. So again, I think it will be here to, it remains to be seen if really those things that China has chosen to be the high tech leader on will also end up being the things that will be driving the world going forward. One thing that really struck me traveling across the world over the past 12 months has been that I saw so many Chinese EVs in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in Jordan, three countries that are quite far away from each other. I mean, Thailand and Vietnam, obviously neighbors, but Jordan in the Middle East. In both countries, 90% of new cars that I saw on the streets were from China. Some of them were German in Jordan, but made in China, like with Chinese letters on them. Speaking then to experts in the EV sector, they're really saying China is absolutely ahead there. And even if the European and other Western manufacturers will catch up, some say they can't even catch up, and others say it will take them decades. So I think super interesting to see this discussion.
That's a great point. And man, I wish, sometimes I'm like, I should work in Europe so I get to travel the world. I get August and September off. I get to go and see new things. But I think you're absolutely right. I was in Mexico for a close friend of mine's bachelor party, and one thing that struck me as well was the prevalence of Chinese cars, particularly EVs. And I've been in some Teslas here in DC. I've been in a couple. My mom has a Volkswagen EV, and they're good products. But what one thing for me with the Chinese is like they're just as advanced, if not more advanced. They're much cheaper, and so this kind of goes to, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but this is kind of goes to the governance of it, where in the West, private companies, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, what have you, they're following demand signals, right? And if there isn't a very clear demand signal, sometimes for businesses it doesn't make sense, or they have to be very careful with large investments into a space. Whereas China can kind of forego that when we're talking about overcapacity. Just their domestic capacity for batteries exceeds the global demand for batteries, right? So they're blowing past any sort of domestic or even global demand signal from consumers. But because the government can, coalesce around these strategic initiatives, it kind of allows them to, it's very economically inefficient, right? When we're talking about subsidies for car companies, when we're talking about subsidies, it keeps a lot of these, I won't say bad companies, but it keeps a lot of inefficient companies or companies that are not as good as producing in the market and continuing to compete for lower and lower prices. And so that kind of becomes with the AI bubble right here in the US, I think this become a very prominent talking point amongst finance and tech circles is like, a lot of the money is circling between Microsoft, Nvidia, Oracle, right? And they all seem to be paying each other the same type of money, and it's a big bucket of money. So when you comes to that, we'll see if the economic bet that they've made will pay off. I think technology, certainly generative AI, has the ability to kind of increase productivity. I don't know if necessarily that trickles down to the average Chinese consumer. That's something that we'll have to watch very closely. But yeah, it's a great point to raise, Aramis.
Yeah, and I think this really embodies the current times that we are in, this new Cold War era, one could say, where you have different blocks across the world racing to become technology leaders and thereby being forced to make a bet on the future, on technology leadership, investing a lot of money and eventually not knowing if it all will be worth it. With this, we've laid out the economic terrain quite well. We have overproduction, deflation risk, shaky property sector, rising debt, and it all remains to be seen if this bet is paying off. China's problems are not just economic, they also come from how the decisions are made, who makes them, and how much flexibility the system still has. And with this, we get right to the core of the issue, because many of the economic problems that we see in China are tied to the centralization of power, which has been further consolidating under the rule of CCP leader and China President Xi Jinping. So in the next block, we will shift from the economy and take a closer look at the political system shaping it.
So after unpacking the economic pressures, now it's just as you said, Armin, it's time to take a look at the political dimension. Yes, Xi Jinping's centralization of power has delivered control in the short term, that's for sure, but it has also introduced that political rigidity. And some political uncertainty is now becoming a major risk to the economy itself, right? So the centralization of political decisions is strong, it's true, but it can also lead to some policymaking brittle, unpredictability, and maybe prone to mistakes, as we've seen this in the tech and education crackdowns in the last years. For investors, entrepreneurs, and citizens, the message is clear. The political climate is volatile, and that has real consequences for innovation and growth. So, Aaron, given Xi Jinping's personalist rule and this unpredictability about these crackdowns, do you think that centralization of power is making China stronger or more fragile? How do you see these tensions?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Fabio. I think one thing I want to mention is what we were discussing before is with this kind of centralization of power, does it make a government stronger, weaker, more flexible, less flexible? And I think it depends on your outlook, right? So here in the West, we would say this makes it weaker, it makes it less flexible. But also, as Aramis was mentioning, the production capacity that China is putting out far exceeds what the West has been able to do. So I think it depends on your outlook. But I think in terms of centralization for China, it certainly does make, the policy-making apparatus more brittle, more prone to mistakes. And if those mistakes do happen, it makes the consequence of those mistakes much more pronounced. I think we have to remember the historic kind of consistency across the CCP that like every CCP leader in modern history since Mao has had to centralize and consolidate their control over the party in order to exert that dominance over the country and actually implement their own policy agenda. Deng did it in the 1980s. Jiang did it after Tiananmen Square, who we see kind of like a failure to do that, where he never fully gained control of the security forces of the military. So he was kind of a leader, but not as effective as, a reformer like Deng. Or now we see Xi Jinping, who was really able to consolidate power very quickly, and he essentially dominates now all political apparatuses of the CCP within China, and it was a very quick consolidation. So I will say it fits within the larger pattern of what we see for CCP leadership. In terms of decision making, I think one thing that's should be very clear in the minds of Chinese policymakers is the oversight of what happens when you don't have feedback mechanisms. And there's some of them like informally that I mentioned earlier, but a big historic example is the Great Leap Forward, where there was all these production targets that were focused on, making so much wheat that a child could sit on the wheat, and, starting iron forges in your backyard. And these were all kind of very politicized, very CCP focused objectives, but it led to obviously the largest human-made famine in history, and the most amount of deaths from just a famine that was not at all natural in cause. So I think that's one of the things that they're thinking about, or should be in the back of their mind as they're thinking about what to do in terms of policy making, how rigid they want to make it. What's concerning to me is with the speed and dominance that Xi Jinping has exerted over the CCP, he's kind of reaching this Mao era, like power within the party. He's kind of removed the term limits. He's kind of set himself up as this big reformist figure, really cracking down on leadership and the organizations that influence policy making. So I think before we could say there was definitely some room to maneuver in terms of policy making. Now I see that room to maneuver narrowing under the Xi leadership.
And I think it's a really worrying sign that you see the loyalists that Xi Jinping himself has installed are regularly disappearing. especially when we're talking about very high-ranking people in the military. This is usually a quite worrying sign that the authoritarian leader has become quite unpredictable, and it's increasingly dangerous for the people below him to really do their work effectively.
Yeah, I think what was it? The October 19th, the sacking of those 9 high-level generals. Those generals, if I understood the report correctly, was mostly from the Fujian gang or the Fujian clique that supported Xi Jinping initially. And it's interesting because I've seen a lot of speculation about, is his control over the PLA wavering? Is that why the removal of a sitting general for the CMC, the China Military Commission, is a very powerful entity within the PLA. And to remove a vice chairman, that hasn't been done since the Cultural Revolution. That was almost 50 years ago. So it's a very big move. I think from my perspective, and I've seen a lot of articles put out about it by now, a lot of the consensus with regard to that is more about anti-corruption, and I think it's coalescing around the Taiwan question, which we'll probably talk about later, of what is the efficiency of the PLA to, coordinate a major military operation in the Taiwan Strait and the island of Taiwan. I think in terms of the European context, the kind of complete failure of Russia to take Ukraine within those first 72 hours, and kind of the after effects of that corruption within the Russian system are very kind of front of mind for the PLA leadership. And so this is more of, I think, in terms of power consolidation, and to kind of go back to the original question, I think centralization does make China both stronger and weaker at the same time. It feels very Chinese to say that, because it gives, the leadership has their decision-making apparatus, but it's behind closed doors. And so it narrows the channels for alternative viewpoints, but it also allows them to kind of coalesce around these major strategic initiatives. I think for Xi's legacy, the Taiwan question will be a major part of that. And I think he's seeing with the Russian situation and how long it's dragged on, and how isolated it's made Russia, that for at least for most people's minds, the Chinese operation, if they are to invade Taiwan, will need to try and be quick in order to kind of avoid any long-term economic setbacks from an intervention in Taiwan. Whether or not that Taiwan has enough to deter that action in the first place is a separate question, but I think that's, kind of where we're at in terms of Chinese centralization and making China stronger or weaker for a lot of these really big questions.
Definitely. Yeah, I guess we'll go more in depth in the Taiwan issue, of especially with all these news coming out from the tensions rising with Japan in the next block. But Aaron, when you talk about the legacy of Xi Jinping, it brings me to my mind this other paradox at the heart of Xi Jinping's system, which is, the narrower the space there is for debate, correction, or other viewpoints, it complicates things a bit for the longer term. And this brings to my mind the issue of succession. Xi Jinping is getting older, and there's no clear successor that has emerged. Right, this vacuum could pose a serious risk to CCP stability. So I'd like to see how you see this issue. What do you think could happen if Xi Jinping leaves office without a strong, clear, agreed upon successor? Do you think that this could trigger any some sort of instability within the party, or I don't know? Well, and as well, if you could tell us about the role of the military, which I know it's a strong actor in China as well.
The right way to frame this question is, because here in DC also, the question comes up of what happens if Xi Jinping slips in the bathroom. This kind of comes up because we're thinking about succession in terms of more almost like monastic type of transfers of power. The CCP particularly has spent decades trying to prevent the type of uncertainty you're describing, right? For the CCP, stability and certainty is the biggest priority for them. And so they've always managed it through a combination of a hierarchy and factional balance, even going back to the era of Mao, who had this whole cult of personality. You still had the Gang of Five. Still had all these kind of minor factions within his pretty dominating sphere. And so what matters for succession is more about the previous transitions relied on balancing strong factions against each other. So, for instance, when Xi entered power, he was in a very weak position when he first ascended to the presidency of the CCP because most of the support around Jiang Zemin was based in what was called the Shanghai clique. It was a lot of the kind of reformist, free market bureaucrats who kind of stood around that. The kind of watershed moment for him was the Ping An insurance story by the New York Times breaking in the Boshi Lai crisis. That kind of gave him this really big bludgeon to say, okay, here's this large established faction that kind of is keeping me from fully controlling the party. And here's this enormous hammer called, broadly anti-corruption, which he still wields today to just absolutely smash him. And so if you look at kind of who was being purged in the initial ascension of Xi during the anti-corruption movement, a lot of it was these officials, bureaucrats, generals from the Shanghai clique, and he was replacing them with the Fujian. So he used to be in Fujian. So he had a Fujian clique, which is a faction that supported him. His family is from Shanxi. And in Shanxi, there's a faction that supports him called the Shanxi Gang. And so a lot of these people were kind of being promoted to power, and it's kind of the basis form of power politics as we can see it. And so that's how he has exerted his very fast, very overwhelming control of the CCP apparatus. When it comes to a successor for Xi Jinping, what I've been talking about, he's kind of eliminated the large majority of the political faction infighting, though I will say with the sacking of those 9 high-level generals, he's essentially destroyed the Fujian clique. So he's destroyed one of his own factions. This has kind of created, I think, an open space for more factions to start coalescing. But I don't think it won't result in like a collapse of the Chinese system, right? It will be a lot of internal elite bargaining. It will be a lot of factional jockeying, which will result in kind of slower policy making as a whole for China. But it won't lead to this whole collapse of the system unless, the key CCP people start to really openly fight. Going back to what you were talking about the PLA, kind of what I was talking about with previous CCP leaders is you need the military, you need the security service on your side to exert the full amount of control. Now, one thing that Xi Jinping's done really well is he's reformed the PLA to essentially be a political body. They swear allegiance to the party, they swear allegiance to him above the party. And so this has kind of made them, they won't be a kingmaker should Xi Jinping die, but they will definitely need to be brought on side by whoever is trying to ascend to his throne in order to really grasp the reins of power in China, as it were. I think China's is more unique in terms of let's think about like let's say an African country where like you have the military is very much a player of, does Colonel Gaddafi shoot a president in the back of the head and assume power? Rebellion in China is very much seen as like kind of a heinous crime and is usually punishable by collective extermination, right? And so to make a move like a coup in China is very risky, not only for you but your family, your extended family. Like, in the Chinese Empire back in the medieval days, right? It was like three separations of family from that person would be executed for these crimes. And so this is kind of a political remembrance from the old imperial days. But yeah, I think to make it more clear, I guess PLA fits as a stabilizing force rather than a kingmaker. And really, what we'll see happen behind closed doors is not really clear because he hasn't tapped his successor yet, who will emerge from the chaos of it. But we won't see it really publicly here in the West because it will be within the party itself.
Yeah, you talked about the issue of those anti-corruption campaigns, Aaron, and them being a tool to really consolidate power. But aside from this, I'd be interested in the state of corruption more in general. Previous to the rule of Xi Jinping, we know that corruption has been a huge issue in China, both in politics and in the economy. Corruption has played a decisive role in getting things into in getting people into higher positions. Do you think that this sweeping anti-corruption campaigns from Xi Jinping also helped to fight against corruption?
Yeah, I think it does. I had a professor back at UCLA who had a really interesting perspective on this, and he grew up during the Great Leap Forward. And he says, if you want to think about China and how difficult it is for Chinese leaders to make decisions, he said any success that you make, right, whether that be at the local, provincial level, at the national level, you must divide by the whole population of China, and any problem that you have to multiply by the whole population of China. And so that is to say, in a system that rewards factionalism, in a system that's very nepotistic in terms of like you want to preserve your own power base because you don't want to be overthrown, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy we're seeing in a lot of ways, right? The Fujian clique, people who were promoted, who benefited from Xi's rise to power and his purges with the anti-corruption stuff, are now themselves being purged for corruption. Um, and so it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where if in order to keep yourself in power and in order to keep yourself secure, you have to you have to use your circle of trust to promote, but that also invites corruption to come from within. I think in terms of kind of where it is in terms of anti-corruption or not, I think he's used it very wisely as a kind of galvanizing for public opinion to say that he's fighting corruption. I think he's mostly used it for um, political moves to consolidate his power and to kind of weed out the undesirables from his own party. But now I think at this point where he exerts so much control on the CPCP, especially with this most recent, the Nine Generals thing, I think it's now more around policy than um, it is around anti-corruption because I think there was like a cash for ranks scheme or something that was uncovered that he had to purge some people over. And so it's just kind of this cloud of, when you bring people in, you have to reward them, kind of like in the United States with political appointees, except these political appointees don't leave, right? And so absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's kind of what we're seeing here in the CCP system. So I don't think it's a battle he'll ever win against corruption. This type of system breeds corruption. But at the same time, what I've seen the reports for his replacement for the CMC vice chair is a person who has done a lot of prosecutions within the party of anti-corruption of high-level people. So I think he is signaling that he's trying to really clamp down on this corruption thing that is throughout the system itself.
Aaron, that's a really important point. I think it's really interesting to also note that everything that happens at the political elite level doesn't happen in a complete vacuum. I mean, of course, as you said, the political feedback in China is differently than what we're experiencing the political systems in other parts of the world. But I think that at the end, whatever happens at the top trickles down into society and ordinary people and how they experience the system one way or another. And I was wondering if if whatever's happening at the top, these pressures that Chinese citizens experience are becoming harder to hide. And I'd like to ask you, I mean, there's several challenges in demographics that we see in China, right? Aging population, a shrinking workforce. Do you think that these pressures and the crackdowns on certain sectors, these issues with corruption, do you think that they're affecting the way that people see the system, especially the young?
Yeah, no, I think China's demographic shifts cut directly to the core of its political and social model. So, when we're talking about, and we're experiencing it all over the world, Europe also is encountering slowing population growth, the United States as well, if you minus immigration. And so we're kind of really reaching this liminal space here in the geopolitics or the political world where, especially for China, the main social bargain with the people is they accept the rule of the CCP in terms of freedoms, liberty, expression, all that sort of thing, in return for stability and opportunity and growing opportunity. I think a lot of people, especially young people, are recognizing that world no longer exists with rapidly aging populations, particularly in Asia. China is aging faster than any major country at its income level. And just in terms of the sheer burden in terms of fiscal responsibility for pension, in return of healthcare, for taking care of the elderly, we're seeing a massive demographic shrink in China where this very much smaller workforce is going to have to support now their parents' generation, their grandparents' generation, even maybe their great grandparents' generation. And it's a lot to ask on top of the social pressures. This is what I was talking about before with real estate and marriages. Is this is affecting young people who are feeling the pressure from their family, feeling the pressure to buy houses, and it's really becoming a demographic and practical strain on the Chinese economy. So I think absolutely this is going to be a major problem for them. They're, I'm sure, working on some type of solution for it, but it will be a foreseeable problem for the Chinese economy in the future decades.
Yeah, I think this workforce issue is especially prevalent in China because the population has such a negative attitude towards immigration. I mean, of course, also see this in the West, but Western societies are much more used to immigration. Even though we're seeing quite an opposition, we at the same time see that there's also a steady flow of immigration. Also, from a historic perspective, people in Europe have always been quite anti-immigration, but immigration has just been happening because it's an economic necessity. But on the other hand, I also think I've also seen some reports, Aaron, that the Chinese youth is more ideologically aligned than older generations, and that Xi Jinping's initiatives, for example, on social media via TikTok and other platforms, played quite a helpful role for his regime there.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a question of social media technology, right? Across the Western world, we're seeing Russia, China to a lesser extent because they're not as used to moving flexibly in a open information environment. But like here in the United States, you can definitely see, you know, political apparatuses using propaganda across social media to influence people. I think in China, where you have a closed system, where you have this great firewall that kind of keeps out all the, you know, mentions of Tiananmen Square and all these sorts of other things, it's much easier to control people's lines of thought around certain things. It's much easier to rile up nationalist sentiment when, you know, let's say Japan does something to remember its, you know, World War II heritage, the Yasukuni Shrine, all that sort of thing. And so it becomes more of a less of an information tool and more of a control tool. And I think that's why we're seeing this convergence of youth opinion on certain topics. We'll see if that continues to hold. I'm not entirely sure, but I think with this new age of surveillance and kind of monitoring of electronic information, it's going to be kind of a major thing for China to see how well they use it, because it could very well spiral out of control for them. We've seen a couple of times where nationalist sentiment really spikes, and I think it goes even beyond what the CCP had anticipated, what they were trying to orchestrate. So, yeah, we'll see how well they're able to manage that tool. But also another good point, Aramis.
Well, Aaron, Armis, to finalize today's conversation, let's zoom out and talk about China's geopolitical and external challenges. As we've discussed, China's domestic challenges are serious, that's for sure, but pressure does not stop at China's borders. Beijing's ambitions, in all terms, technological, economic, military, are increasingly colliding with hard geopolitical realities, from trade and tech restrictions to a declining global image and the looming Taiwan issue. As Art has mentioned before, China is navigating a complex web of pressures externally, and each misstep could have major implications for its economy and the political system. So, Aaron, as we've seen these past months from the US and its allies imposing certain restrictions on specific sectors, on specific products such as semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, and at the same time, we see China's, doing similar approaches back. How do you see these tensions growing? I mean, there was, of course, a truce, you could say, a commercial truce that was shaken some weeks ago, a month ago. But do you think that the difference of approaches and economic ambitions of both blocs will be resolved without major escalations in the future?
Yeah, no, great question, Fabio. I think the competition between China and the West, or I should say the relationship, because it's not necessarily competition yet. We're not in Aramis reference like a second Cold War. I don't think we're there because if we think about the Cold War, right, you had the Warsaw Pact, you had the Soviet Union. they did not interact economically at all with the West, right? With the free world and the developing world. So we're in a very different competition, a very different environment, market-wise, where we are so intertwined. The supply chains globally are so intertwined between China and the West that it's hard to even, there was a lot of conversation in the Trump first administration about decoupling, right? And I think those processes have continued on. But we're seeing now in 2025, about to go into 2026, how truly difficult that is. One layer of this is structural. The rise of technologically capable China is always going to create friction with, the EU regulations on technology policy and AI, and as well as the U.S. dominance in that space. The other is going to be political, and what we were talking about before about the centralization of power is, Beijing had a lot of good grace as China did the BRI, as China was doing kind of a lot of the South to South diplomacy. But as he's kind of consolidated this cult of personality around him, as we've seen in the last couple of years, it's made diplomacy and national ambition kind of be intertwined and made it harder for diplomacy and international policy to be removed from political decision making. So we have to remember that China's recent assertiveness did not happen in a vacuum. If you look at China's political clout at the UN General Assembly, for instance, countries in Africa that recognize Taiwan at the formation of the Chinese Communist Party, pretty much everyone supported Taiwan. But through soft diplomacy, through economic power, through development investments, essentially there's only one country left in Africa that still supports Taiwan as the true China. And China's used their economic power to, I won't say coerce, because at that time it was more about, brother to brother, comrade to comrade type of investment. But now it's becoming more coercive. China is now feeling it's safe in its position at home, that it can start throwing its weight around in the international field a little bit more. And that's where we're encountering, the gray zone conflict in the South China Sea, which is kind of alarmed Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN. We've seen China use kind of coercive economic measures on South Korea and Europe, which has caused great consternation across Brussels, London, South Korea, Tokyo, to be more aware of the economic ties that these countries are having to China. And that leads into the technology front, where we have U.S. and key partner and allies moving towards selective decoupling on semiconductors. And now I will say, as kind of a caveat, these are targeted, they're not comprehensive, right? We're not slapping China with an enormous boilerplate of restrictions, but they are designed to slow China's access or capabilities with military value and their long-term industrial plans. Now, this is kind of the weakness of China, is China can try and innovate around those restrictions. And we've seen kind of the emergence of DeepSeek. We've seen the emergence of China producing some mid-level to mid to high-level semiconductor chips. But I'm sure the Europeans know ASML is the only country in the world that produces the tools that the founders use to produce semiconductors. So it's very difficult, even for China, to innovate and move around these restrictions, because for these very high-level technologies, you do need a lot of international cooperation. You need a lot of international partnership. So I will say China's not fully isolated, but it definitely faces more skepticism from advanced economies and is getting a little bit more pushback from ASEAN for neutrality in the Indo-Pacific than I think that they would like.
One way to look at this is that a lot of China's success is coming from something we could call natural alignment. So China just increasingly cooperating with certain countries and then automatically becoming more popular with those. For example, China has become the most important trading partner basically for every country in the world, aside from a few in the West. And with that, naturally, there will come some influence. And this, I think, also what has been so far the reason why the US has been so powerful. We've seen also a lot of natural alignment here. The US is one of the major reasons why the US is so powerful today is this thing we call soft power. So just the cultural appeal of the US, the economic might, is making other countries want to develop in that direction. And what I feel is now the mistake of China perhaps is that they do not only rely on this anymore, but also now increasingly going down the more coercive line. And the South China Sea is a very interesting battleground where we're increasingly seeing this play out. But perhaps perhaps the region where we are seeing the most aggressiveness. This is, of course, the question of Taiwan and the north of Japan. For China, this is, of course, a very serious issue. It absolutely sees Taiwan as part of its territory, and it has a very concrete ambition to integrate Taiwan as soon as possible. I think the internal deadline that Xi gave China, Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, is 2050. So how do you see the whole Taiwan issue playing out? Will China use the iron fist here, or rather try to go forward with the carrot and gradually just try to align with Taiwan?
Yeah, I think that's really the question of the day, right? And we have a lot of organizations here in DC who are focused on this question. I think I will say, in terms of military projection, I agree with the National Bureau of Asian Research here in DC that I don't think as much tonnage as China's is the PLA Navy is putting out in terms of production. I don't think it has the operational capacity to operate in the South China Sea in a meaningful way. I think if there's any sort of military engagement, it will be in the Taiwan Strait and Taiwan itself. Now, the question really becomes what happens if China decides to do a full invasion of Taiwan. I think most people agree the most likely scenario would be a full maritime blockade of Taiwan, destroying the undersea cables or the undersea cable terminals in Taiwan to kind of isolate them. And then it really becomes a question of I don't think China realistically thinks it will seize the TSMC foundries in Taiwan, and those engineers will find ways to escape. I'm sure America and Europe are very interested in getting those engineers out of there should China invade. And so it's really a question of deterrence, I think, at this point. Is China willing to take the economic potential toll of what the intervention in Taiwan would do versus what is the final final net profit at the end of the day. I think it's interesting you mentioned geography, Aramis, because when we think of like the US, right, very safe in terms of you've got Canada to your north, not a threatening neighbor, Mexico to your south, usually a trade partner. There's some issues, but surrounded on both sides by ocean, where I think China almost has an opposite problem where it's aligned itself with Russia, it's aligned itself with Central Asian republics because it's so limited by geography. The South China Sea, Strait of Malacca represents, 70% of their oil is imported through the sea routes. Any sort of disturbance of those trade routes for China could be economically disastrous. So it wants to keep a very small, targeted, and not disruptive event in Taiwan as much as humanly possible. Now, when you're talking about armed conflict, it's not always possible to do that. And so I think it creates a stability problem. AUKUS continues to exist for now. We'll see what the next National Defense Review puts out. But a Taiwan crisis could disrupt global semiconductors, fracture China's ties with the West. So it really is going to be a long-term political outcome over the short-term confrontation. And really, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the centralization of Xi Jinping is, does the political reality for Xi, who controls the apparatus of the CCP, does there come a time when maybe he, I'm not saying this is true, but like maybe let's say he has terminal cancer and he has to make a decision for himself. Does he want his legacy to be reunification with Taiwan? And does that mismanagement of political operations or political signaling, does that lead to kind of an armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific?
And for these geographical reasons that you've just mentioned, I think that it's such a slippery slope for China to go down the more assertive route. I mean, if you have 70% of your oil and gas demand coming through the Strait of Malacca and so many countries around it controlling it, potentially them becoming your enemies could become a huge issue for you. And so anything very hard power style thing that they do against Taiwan or any of their neighbors, it could go down in a very bad way. And we already see that the relations between China and its neighbors around the South China Sea have really soured over China's increasingly aggressive approach. So it really remains to be seen if China rather prioritizes its development or its immediate ideological goals. one thing is the question here: if they prioritize their ideological goals, will they then create maybe a threat for the survival of the ideology itself? Because if you invade Taiwan, and it could have severe implications for the world economy, and we wouldn't know what the end of that would be. So yes, very interesting to be going ahead on that, Fabio.
No, Aramis, I just wanted to say that I remember you had a conversation with a geopolitical risk expert, French, Marie Mortes. I remember last year or a couple of years ago when you went into this question in depth. I think that the episode's focus was fully on this hypothesis: what would happen if China intervened in Taiwan? And I remember you explored different scenario. So I would just recommend our listeners to take a look at it. The description will be below. And also in terms of time, I mean, we discussed here for an hour about all the different multi-layer and deeply interconnected challenges that China face. I mean, we start with those economic overcapacity challenges. Then we went to the political side of things with this rigidity, with no clear successor. And then, of course, all these geopolitical pressures that make things even more complicated. But, I mean, Aaron, we could be talking here for hours. I mean, the discussion has been super interesting. There's so many more things I'd like to maybe touch in another conversation in the following months or year. But anything that I could just say at the moment is thank you for your time. It's been super insightful. I wish it's the same for our listeners. And well, hopefully we'll have many more things to discuss in the coming year. We appreciate your time a lot.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Armas. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope your listeners find it useful. Looking forward to seeing this episode come out, and I'll definitely take a look at that Taiwan geopolitical risk episode as well. But thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Aaron.